Reconstruction, A Success or Failure by Ariana Deeds. Reconstruction was a time in American history filled with optimism, but it also consisted of hatred, contempt, stubborn racism, and vile acts of retaliation. The amount of prejudice and hierarchical utilization leads me to say that Reconstruction was a failure, in that it failed to enforce equality and the integration of African Americans into a cohesive society with the white community. Some background knowledge for the Reconstruction era. In the 1860s, slavery was abolished through the Union's victory in the Civil War against the Confederacy in the South. Shortly after, the 13th Amendment was ratified, saying slavery and indentured servitude shall no longer exist in the United States, except in the use of convicted punishment. With the legal enforcement of no more slavery in the South, many plantation owners grew resentful at losing what they believed was their rightful property. Many of them, however, created labor contracts with former slaves where they would pay them a very low salary and provide housing in exchange for their continued work in the fields. With President Lincoln's death in 1865, Andrew Johnson became the 17th President of the United States. According to Eric Foner in Freedom's Dream Deferred, Johnson was, quote, deeply racist, out of touch with Northern public opinion, and incapable of dealing with Congress, end quote. This shows that America had a long road ahead of them compared to the hope that President Lincoln gave to the colored community for their well-deserved equality. Not much later, the 14th Amendment passed, stating that no state could deny a person their constitutional rights based on the color of their skin. Because the white community wanted to maintain any sense of social normalcy, many laws were put into place to try and keep the social status of whites on top. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed that gave colored men their right to vote. In retaliation, more laws were passed to make it very difficult for the colored community to be able to vote, including poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, etc. Through all these hardships, African Americans continued to fight for their right to be treated as equals in a country that had never done so in the past. After the North's victory in the Civil War, many African Americans left their plantations in an attempt to start their own lives. Many went in search of new jobs to buy their own land and to live normal lives, and you can see an example in the top left political cartoon of a white man getting upset that he has to work his own land because he can no longer force people to do it for free. You can also see the former slaves smiling and happy to be able to finally leave their place of servitude. The first step towards this freedom was getting an education in order to debunk paternalism. Former slaves of all ages attended segregated schools where you would see ages ranging from toddlers to men and women of old age. Many African American men were elected to positions of political power during Reconstruction, Josiah Thomas Walls being the man you see in the bottom left. He was a former slave that was voted as one of Florida's congressmen in 1870. In the political cartoon on the right, you can see three white men standing with their foot on the back of a colored man. These white men are meant to represent Irishmen, former Confederates, and corrupt moneymen that are conspiring together against African Americans through burning school buildings, churches, and many other vile acts that were meant to scare the colored community into submission. Something that many white supremacists political leaders did in the South was instill laws to prevent African Americans from voting. You had to be able to pass a literacy test, pay poll taxes, and somehow get past grandfather clauses that were used to keep descendants of slaves out of the toll booths. They did this because the white men believed if African Americans could vote, then it would be a black-run country, and that worried many of them because they were scared of losing control. Even in the instance that they could get their ballots in the ballot box, many whites would stuff ballot boxes full of votes and intimidated black voters with physical and economic threats before they could even enter the buildings. Again, more fear tactics. Lynching became a very common practice in southern states. Ida B. Wells Barnett said, quote, "No colored man, no matter what his reputation, is safe from lynching if a white woman, no matter what her standing or motive, cares to charge him with insult or assault." end quote. Crowds would gather to watch these mutilations happen. You can see in the political cartoon on the right the depiction of an African American man mourning the death of his friends and family at the hands of a white supremacist group known as the White Liners. But many other white supremacist groups would participate in these vile acts as well, such as the Ku Klux Klan. Many men, women, and children, and even political leaders like the police, judges, and county mayors would watch and sometimes participate in these vigilante atrocities that majority of the time didn't have any evidence to show a crime had even been committed. There was an instance where a 14-year-old Emmett Till had supposedly whistled at a white woman. That boy was kidnapped, mutilated, killed, and dumped in a river, all because a white woman thought he had disrespected her. To further enforce the social hierarchy separating the white and colored communities, separate but equal laws were put into place. When Congress made its ruling in the Plessy versus Ferguson case of 1896, Justice Brown said, quote, "If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane," end quote. This means that so long as a colored person's constitutional rights are being met, it is not up to Congress to enforce the integration of these two races. The effects of Reconstruction in this brutal time in history can be seen even today. In the video, How Lynching Still Affects American Politics, it goes on to say that, quote, "Counties that were exposed to a higher number of lynchings are less likely to register to vote, and they are less likely to indicate that they voted in a recent election," end quote. Imagine growing up hearing stories of how your great-grandfather or grandfather had tried to stand up and vote for what he believed to be right, only to be brutally tortured and burned alive by a white man the next day. If I had been told these kinds of stories growing up, I would have been scared to do anything that would get me or my family hurt. Just like these stories of caution are passed down through the generations of the colored community, so are the white men's stories of having to make sure the colored people know their place. It's a horrible mindset that is still passed down today. One of the last reported lynchings was in Alabama in 1981. Not even half a century ago, people were still killing other people to control the ballot in favor of the white man. Reconstruction was a failure. On paper, the colored community had all of their lawful constitutional rights, but on a social level, they had never experienced so much unrelenting cruelty, and many still do to this day.